of Muslims in Britain and Christian-Muslim relations since 1986. He's actually one of our teachers. He's a long-time supporter of this institute, and it's a great honour to have him back. If I leave the floor open for you.
Thank you very much. That's the kind of length of introduction you really want. Well, friends, thank you very much. The task of the afternoon is for me to share some of my experience of teaching non-Muslim people what I call understanding Islam. And the understanding part is really quite important, and it's a theme that will recur as the afternoon goes on. Because what we need to try to do is to help people to understand what Islam is about. If you want to get somebody to understand something, you've got to make it fit. You can't get them to understand a square thing in a round framework. You've got to make it fit a framework that people can understand. So my head has to fit what you're trying to tell me. So that's a model that I want you to keep in your mind through the afternoon. As Faiz was saying, I've been studying Islam since 1986. Indeed, on these sacred acres, as it were, we used to have, just on the other side of the Bristol Road from here, this was part of what we call the Federation of the Selly Colleges. This was one of those colleges. And in the Federation, which contained 14 different either colleges or teaching units, we had a specialist postgraduate centre for the study of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations, which was founded in 1976 and which was unique in Europe because it had joint Christian and Muslim teaching staff, Christian and Muslim governance, and Christian and Muslim students. And we had people coming from all over the world who wanted to be part of that learning experience. And it was at a postgraduate level, which meant some people were coming to do doctorates, some people were coming to do master's degrees, but an awful lot of people would come for a period of, let's say, between 3 and 12 months in order to top up their understanding and to get a new insight. So we used to get people on sabbaticals, either short sabbaticals or long sabbaticals. And they would join the life of the centre for that period of time. So that was where I began, and that was after having spent 9 years studying Christian theology and then going into education studies and having become a schoolmaster and so on. So I'm really an overgrown schoolmaster. That's really what it amounts to, who happens to know a little bit about Christian theology and a little bit about Islamic studies. Now, the second thing to say is that only children think that their teachers are always right. So I don't expect you necessarily to agree with what I do and what I say. But I hope that by my sharing what I do and what I say, you will be able then to think about ways that will be helpful for you to do and say similar things. So I am not coming here, as it were, with a blueprint to say this is how you do it, folks. I'm just coming to share my experience and then to help you reflect. And what I will try to do all the time through the afternoon is to explain why I do it like that. Why do I start there? Why do I present it in this way? And to give you some examples for ways that I think promote helpful understanding. So that's really what I want to try and do in the course of the afternoon. What have I done in this last 30 years, nearly? I've worked in documentation on Muslims in Britain for 5 years, set up a primary school B.Ed degree for young Muslim women who wanted to become primary school teachers in another one of the colleges here. Worked on a couple of educational projects amongst Muslims. How do we make Islam more intelligible in secondary school curriculum? That failed. How do we do a better job at training imams for service in Britain? That failed, and so on. So failures are also part of the story. Then for 6 years, I was the interfaith advisor for the city of Birmingham, paid for by the Church of England for the welfare of humankind. That was the way I saw it. It wasn't necessarily quite the way they saw it, but they kept paying the checks every month, so they were very good. Because one of the things I want to say is, we in Britain, and especially in a city like Birmingham, are actually embarked on what I call the greatest sociological experiment of Europe of the last 500 years. We have never been in this situation before of having such hugely cosmopolitan communities. Not just in terms of multi-faith, but in terms of multi-ethnicity, multi-culture, multi-everything. We've never been here before. Secondly, you must remember that the way that Europe over the last 500 years has dealt with religious difference has been by persecution, by segregation, and if you can get hold of the blighters, by killing them. That's the way that Europe deals with religious difference. That's part of the European psyche. So that you've got Catholic killing Protestant and Protestant killing Catholic, and one lot of Protestants killing another lot of Protestants, and people being driven from one part of Europe to another. And then when they're driven out finally and they decide, let's go to America, the land of the free, as soon as they arrive, they kneel down, say their prayers of thanksgiving, and then they start persecuting each other. So it seems to be something rather deep in the European mentality. And European persecution of Jews is only, as it were, the extreme end of that spectrum. Now that's part of European history. And one of the things I want to say in the course of the afternoon is, if you don't understand the culture and the history of the society of the people to whom you're trying to speak about Islam, you are going to miss them in the dark. So you need to understand that's part of our European mentality. Now that should have frightened the wits out of you, because it means if we don't get it right in building multicultural, multi-faith, multi-everything, Britain, Birmingham and Europe, it could go horribly wrong. And we will be very foolish to think that that is not possible. Therefore, we have every incentive to get this thing right. After those years, 2005, I finished here in Birmingham, and I was asked to go to London for 5 years, paid for by a group of Christian and Muslim charities, collectively trying to keep me alive for 5 years, exclusively to teach courses on understanding Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. And I'm pleased to say that I nearly killed myself over those 5 years, because there was such an enormous demand that I was running all over Greater London, 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. So there is a huge need and a huge demand if only we can find the right delivery tools. People desperately want to understand about Islam. Why? Well, for all sorts of reasons. Some people would come saying, it cannot be as bad as the media say. Tell me something different. Other people come and they say, I hate all Muslims. Tell me why. Others would say, I hate all Muslims except the ones that I know. Others would come and say, well, actually, my son or daughter is going out with or is married to a Muslim. My son or daughter has become a Muslim. Or actually, my father was a Muslim, but he was never practicing, but I really want to know about his life and culture. You'll be amazed how many people in British society actually have got a family link in some way with Islam. And the number of people who will come along and say, it could be I'm going to get a Muslim son-in-law, so I feel I better understand something about what motivates him, what drives him. So we have this huge need to meet. I used to run a variety of things, and they're quite important. I used to run 10-week courses, 2 hours a week. And I would run 6 of those simultaneously every term. And we would run them in this way. I didn't have a centre, which was very good for the economics, because I didn't have to upkeep it or heat it or light it or leave it empty when I was out doing the job. So instead, the course would go to the people where they lived. A church hall, a mosque, a bit of a school, somebody's house, community rooms, scout hut, wherever it was. Now, what I want to say here is that we have lots of people in our society who have never been inside a mosque, who've never had a conversation with a Muslim, and they are frightened. It may be true that you are a wild beast and you're about to bite my head off. So we have got to find ways of stepping over that barrier. And we have to step over the barrier. We can't expect them to do it. Therefore, having a lovely room like this and saying, please come, is only going to attract middle-class course goers. And you have to reach out to the vast majority of society, not just middle-class course goers. And one of the ways that I did that is that I took it to them. So I was on their territory. I was the vulnerable one. And it meant that it was just around the corner. I didn't say, please will you make an hour and a half's journey across London every night, every Thursday night for 10 weeks. It was, will you come to the church hall at the end of the road? And therefore it makes it much easier for them and makes them much more comfortable. Another thing that I want to say is that I was doing what I call adult popular education. Adult means everything from 16 to 102. My record was a 100-year-old lady who had her 100th birthday during the course and had the audacity to ask for the evening off so that she could have a 100th birthday party. But she did say that it was only because her family insisted. And then she was beaten when we had a 102-year-old lady who completed the course. So a vast age range. Everybody wants to know about this thing. A lot of people, of course, would be in the kind of 50 plus, because the reality is that most people, if they're out at work, rushing home after work, have got children to look after, getting them out in the evening is not easy. Saturday schools were very good for the young people who didn't have family commitments and for older people who didn't need to see the grandchildren that Saturday. But you have to tailor the times and the delivery to the people that you're trying to reach. The other thing is the word popular. I recommend to you, especially if you're feeling strong in the stomach, that one day you go and buy a range of different newspapers. Not to read the content, but to read the style, the structure of the English that's used, and the sentence structure, what kind of material they cover. Now, teachers will tell you that we work around things called reading ages. So functional literacy, that means I can read a sentence, is 7. Below that, you can read cornflakes on the packet, but you couldn't work with a sentence. Functional literacy is 7. The Sun has a reading age of 8. The middle tabloids have a reading age of 12. That's what we're talking about with the Mail, the Express. The Mirror is a little bit less than that. By the time you get to 15, you're on the Independent and you're on the Times. And if you get to 18, that's the Guardian. Now, the Guardian sells 240,000 copies a day. The Sun sells 1.3 million copies a day. Now, the reality is that the person who was reading the Sun literally could not read the Guardian. The English would be too hard for them. The vast majority of people in Britain leaving school have a reading age of 12 or under when they leave. That means that if you are addressing Guardian readers, you are excluding the vast bulk of the adult population of this country. If you are addressing Times and Independent readers, you're still excluding the majority by far. So you have got to be able to communicate and to write and to speak at that 12-year-old, reading age 12. It doesn't mean 12-year-old child, it means a reading age of 12. Now, that isn't easy. It's much easier to write for the Times than it is to write for the Sun. Because trying to say something intelligent when you can only have 5 words in a sentence, when you can't have any subordinate clauses, when you can only have 1 polysyllabic word in a paragraph, that is not easy. So, learning the art of communication, it's making the key fit the lock. That's what understanding is about. So I spent 5 years doing that, and then the money ran out, which was expected. It wasn't because I was useless at the job, I promise. But the money did run out at the end of 2010. And what I now spend my time is, apart from doing things like this and running around and delivering intensive courses, I run a website. And here it is, so you can make a note of it if you want to. If you want to see, well, how does the cowboy actually do it in practice, have a look at the website. You will find a button called Understanding Islam Course, and that is a course that I'm currently doing on Ahlul-Bayt television, 36 half-hour programs. So eventually there'll be 36 videos up there, and there'll be 36 articles to go with them. So you can see both the content and the style and the language that's used. There's a new book which is going up there, Short Guide to Understanding Islam, 20,000 words intended to put into the hands of anybody. I mean, the reality is that you can go to any mosque I've ever been to in this country, and if you say to them, please can you give me an intelligent guide to understanding Islam that I can understand, you will fail. You will either get something that's written in such appalling English that even the author couldn't understand it, or you will get something that is intended as a piece of dawah to convert people, or you will get something that completely misses what they want. Or at very best, you will get something that gets into minute details of how you do wudu or something, as though that is about what Islam is about. So we have a real crisis. Why do we not have, after all these decades of Muslim communities in this country, why do we not have intelligent guides to understanding Islam that are available in every mosque for all the groups and all the people who come to visit? Well, you can answer the question. Now, and there's all sorts of other stuff up there. Okay, that's enough about me. What we're going to do is we're going to break the afternoon up so that if anybody falls asleep, we'll notice. So this is a pause. And the rule that I give for my classes is very simple. If you do not ask questions, you will be punished by me continually speaking. So it's up to you, really. Interesting, notice how the room is set out. First of all, I've got eye contact with every one of you. So I'm not talking to the wall or talking that you can't see me and I can't see you. We've established eye contact. This is non-verbal communication to say, actually, I'm quite a friendly customer. I don't have a table in front of me as a barrier between you and me. That's non-verbal communication to say, if they come for me, I'll shove the table at them and run. You know, it's really important. Think about, if you want to talk to people, how do you arrange the encounter? How do you set things up? How do you frighten the life out of somebody? You know? Think about what you wear. Not just about the cut of the clothes, but the colour of the clothes. I had one of our former students from Al-Mahdi who came as a resource person, and it was all going great. And at the third week, we were on our way, and I said, have you noticed that every week so far you've worn a black headscarf? No. Well, they're all thinking that that's part of the game. And from that time onwards, she changed the colour of her headscarves every week. Because you're sending a different message. You're sending a different message. So it's not just what you wear and the cut of it, but it's the colour, the feel, and if I am wearing black, because actually it's Muharram, and it's part of our tradition, well, explain. Do you know, guys, if you hadn't noticed, this is Muharram, and I'm always in black because we're in mourning this time. Now, this is what it's about. But if you hang around to the end of the course, we'll be out of Muharram, and you can see me in my goldy glitz then, okay? So explain. You've got to be thinking all the time, what's in their heads? What messages are they taking from the way that I conduct myself? Right. Anybody want to jump in now? Right, punishment begins. Now, the next thing I want to look at is, where do you start? Because I would argue, and remember, I've got, some of you, we found out this morning, I've been longer at this than some of you have been on earth, so excuse that. I have loads of experience at taking people into mosques and asking Muslim imams, resident alims, teachers, somebody, whoever, tell us something about Islam. And it's like plugging in a tape recorder. Huh? There are 5 pillars to Islam. Huh? Oh, believe this, do that. And what you've just done is to confirm exactly what they thought when they walked in through the door. That Islam is a bunch of rituals performed by freaky people, and you've just proved it. Because that's actually the message you're sending. Because all you're talking about are religious rituals. And you're talking about them very often in a very legalistic way. We have to pray at these times, and this is what we do, and we've got to make wudu, and the water's got to go under your ring and over your nail varnish, as it were. Now, do you know, what messages are you sending when you do that kind of thing? Even if we just begin, which is kind of the better end of the normal spectrum, there was a prophet called Muhammad, etc., Mecca, Medina, Quran, Hijrah. Great. What have you done? You've just fundamentally distorted the picture of Islam. I call that trying to read a detective novel and opening it at chapter 10. You get the denouement, but you haven't got a clue what the plot was. Now, how often do we talk about Islam exactly fitting the perception of outsiders who think it's a freaky religion drawn up by Muhammad in the 7th century? That's how we do it. And therefore, you've completely lost the plot. And I say to them, however, just remember, Muslims never say Muhammad is the only prophet, but always that he's the last. Never say the Quran is the only revelation, but always that it's the last and final revelation. Now, if you are the last of something, there must have been others that went before, otherwise you can't be the last. So if we start there, we are by its very nature distorting the whole picture. That's our first problem. Second problem is, where do you start? Well, what I generally do is to go back from there to a biblical picture and I take Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, Isaac and Ishmael, and there's a family tree. So we can then begin to see Judaism, Christianity and Islam interacting with each other. And when they go, whoa, that's good, and you then say, but this is only the history of one tiny portion of humanity. The people of the Middle East, the Semitic races. Tells you nothing about the Chinese or the Eskimos or the South Americans, you know. So again, you fundamentally distorted the picture of Islam. So this is where I want to start the story. I say that the only place that Muslims can start to talk about Islam is with God. Because God is the only eternally existing being. God is the creator of all that exists. Therefore, that's the only possible starting point to the story. To start anywhere else is fundamentally to miss the point. Then, incidentally, I always say, what happens if you translate the word God into Arabic? You get the word Allah. What does it mean? It means the one and only God. Because again, the way a lot of us talk, it's as though Allah is the Muslim God. We have claimed proprietorial rights over God. He's my God. Try going telling that to 14 million Arabic mother tongue Christians in the world. Guess what they call God? Try going saying that to 2 million Arabic mother tongue Jews in the world. Guess what they call God? So there is a terrible tendency, and we all do it in our different religions, to actually privatize God. Now you remember, one of the charges that the Quran lays against the Jews is to say, you have claimed proprietorial rights over God. God is not your God. God is the God of all humankind. So every time that we are speaking about God in such a way that it privatizes it, we are actually fundamentally denying the most central truth of Islam. That is that there is only one God, and that one God is the creator of everything that exists, and that one God is a sustainer of everything that exists, and therefore everything that exists is by nature in a relationship with God. Anything less than that is a fundamental distortion of the most basic principle. That's why I always, when I'm speaking English, speak of God as God, so that we break that mindset that says Allah is the Muslim God. Just crucially important that we think about what language we're using, what words we're using, and later on we'll come to see how you might think of translating some of them and some of the pitfalls there. So this is where I want us to start then, to talk about the relationship between the Creator and the creation. And the green arrow here represents what is that relationship. And I want to suggest that that relationship is built up by all these bank of concepts here, of harmony and balance and safety and security, of justice, due order, peace, obedience, and conforming to the great designer's plan. And I want to suggest that is the relationship between the Creator and everything that exists, everything that is created, in its original wonderful state before it all starts going horribly wrong. Because what's the difference between me and God? Well, God is outside of time and space. God is not limited, whereas I am. And the rest of creation is. So I go wonky and don't function as well as I used to when I was younger. But God doesn't have that problem. So again, we're trying to unpack some of these concerns that people have. Remember that for the vast majority of people in Britain, they have no understanding at all of what a religion is about. They think religion is a leisure pursuit. Sunday morning, I go and dig the allotment, you go to church. Leisure pursuit. Or they think it's a bunch of ritual practices. Well, no, it's 5 times a day prayers, or it's fasting during Ramadan or something. Now, if people have no idea what it's about and we are reinforcing it, then we're doing a huge disservice, and it would have been better to shut up. Now, that's where I think I want to start the story, and to talk about a harmony and a balance within the creation. If I'm in harmony with God and you're in harmony with God, we should be in harmony with each other. I want to talk about that being a state of due order. Now, if you were to go and ask Brother Plato, what does justice mean? Plato says justice is everything in its rightful place. Everything according to the pattern. One of the things then we need to be doing is to building links of understanding between what people already know and what we want to say. Because what I want to do is to get to a situation where somebody says to me at the first coffee break after an hour, "Here, Governor, I'm a Christian, I haven't heard you say anything yet that I don't agree with." Because when that penny drops, we're beginning to make some progress. So you're trying to make links with people. You know, you've heard of Plato. What did Plato say justice was? Everything in its rightful place. What's this then? Now, peace can only come about when you have justice. Lots of people have that concept. You can only have it when everything works according to the great designer's plan. Now, for me and you, that includes obedience. For daffodils, it doesn't. But again, you see, Islam is not about human beings. It's about the whole of creation. So the planets are Muslim. They go around their set orbits the way that God intended. The daffodils are Muslim. They come up out of the ground, they look for the sun and they turn toward it. That's the way that God programmed them. That's the way God designs it. So what's the difference between me and a daffodil? Obedience. I have free will. I am able to choose to submit or to rebel. Daffodils aren't. So everybody's all saying, yeah, this makes some sense. Now you are trying to appeal to the natural intelligence of human beings. We'll come on to why in a minute if it's not obvious. Now we can move from that to say, here's a nice little Arabic lesson. Arabic root, bundle all that up together, and you have the Arabic root SLM. And then from SLM, I make Islam and Muslim and Salam, and then I begin to explain about a family of words that have a relationship with each other. And then I say, notice very carefully, I'm spelling all these with small letters. Because I'm talking about what I call generic Islam. That is, the state of harmony, justice, etc. that exists from the very first moment of creation, and which has been taught by God from the first moment of creation to the whole creation, right up to our own times. So I am wanting to make this as all-encompassing as possible. Now, what we're then saying is that Islam does not begin with Muhammad, we've done that, or Abraham, we've done that. It doesn't even begin with the first human being. We don't know when they arrived. But it begins with the very first moment that God creates anything. So God creates a Muslim universe. God creates everything in the state of Islam. Now, we're talking then about what technically we'd call Din al-Fitra. Of course, we want to translate that as religion. And that's what screws us up. I want to translate it instead as being the natural way of life, the natural state of every human being, which leads to human flourishing in this life and leads to the ever closer approach to the infinity of God in paradise. So that's the way that I want to translate that. Because one of the things we need to think through is, what do you think Islam is for? What's it all about? You know, if it's just a bunch of hurdles that you have to jump over, which is what most people think religion is about, you know, it's a set of hurdles that religious people put in the way of decent human beings to keep screwing them up and occupying their time. Well, if it's not that, what else is it then? Well, it's what we do as an insurance policy so God won't send us to hell. Awful lot of religious people will use a way of speaking about it that's what it sounds like. I don't want to go to hell, therefore I'm going to do this. Well, you remember the lovely saying of Imam Ali where he says, you know, some people worship God out of fear of hell. Yeah, that is the worship of slaves. Some people worship God out of the hope of the reward of heaven. That is the worship of the businessman. And others worship God out of love for God alone. You know the story. Now, you know, often the way we talk about it, it sounds like we're either slaves or businessmen. Now, once you get to this stage, then you see, and you're talking about generic Islam and generic Muslim, you've broken through a lot of those barriers. Because then you can then talk about the Muslim mineral world, the Muslim vegetable world, and then you can come on to salam. Yeah, now, how are you going to translate salam? See, because all the books would tell, peace be with you, brother. Peace be with you too, mate. Now we can begin to unpack that. May you come ever more fully and completely into that state of perfect peace, that state of perfect harmony and balance, safety, security, etc., which will only come about when you and the rest of creation live according to the great designer's plan. Now can there be anything better that I wish you was a greeting? Now you're talking a language that people can understand here. Because if you just say, peace be with you, that means no fighting today. Because people have a very, very truncated notion of what peace might be about. So you need to unpack it and expand it. And expand it in a way which is touching the human heart. People say to me sometimes, how do you evaluate your work? You know, every teacher knows you have to go through these wretched criteria, you know, how do you evaluate the course you've just taught? And it's a head-banging exercise. Now, some people expect me to evaluate my work by saying, how many people have you converted to Islam? And some people expect me to evaluate my work by saying, how many Muslim participants have you converted to Christianity? So how do I evaluate my work? Now, what we've been talking about in this process here is to see Islam as the natural condition of the human being, living in a state of harmony, etc., in which I flourish as a human being. Not just in this life, but also in my infinite progression in the life to come. If that is the case, and if we really are saying, you know, we've got the primordial covenant, the pre-embodied souls in the Quran, that story and so on, what we're saying is that every human being, by virtue of being human, has got an Islam-shaped vacuum inside them. And that needs to be filled by an experience of that relationship with God that we're trying to build up through following in the way. Therefore, my way of evaluating what I do is to listen for a response that says, what you are saying reverberates with me. What you are saying strikes a chord in my heart. This makes some sense. I don't necessarily agree, not yet anyway, and I'm not even a believer, let alone a Muslim, but what you're saying makes some human sense to me. Now, I would suggest that if we don't get that reaction, if people say, what you're saying is absolutely freaky and outside my human experience, either we're not teaching very well, or we're not actually teaching about Islam at all. Because if I was to teach you the culture of the Eskimos, you might find it a trifle unusual. So often we are teaching culture and cultural imprints rather than full hardcore Islam. And the way I want to evaluate that is to say, if it is truly Islam, it reverberates in the hearts of human beings. Not because they're believers, because they're human beings. That's all that's necessary. And I want to take that criteria through, and I want to explore it a little bit more with an example. My example is, I would say that there is no course I have ever done that I have not had a question about hijab. Now, the stupid thing about it is, when people ask a question about hijab, they mean women's dress. That's what they mean. Why do women wear those funny clothes? So how you answer it fundamentally determines how people understand it. Because the big temptation is to go into some wattle story about, covering up and, auras and all this kind of stuff. And what you've done is to say, this is why those freaky women do these freaky things. You haven't touched the human heart at all. At very best, there's some understanding. Oh yeah, okay. Bit odd, but okay. Now, if you approach it the other way, from the point of view of saying, we are speaking to every human heart, and you think, when does the Quran use the term hijab? Well, it tells us there's a hijab between this earth and the life of paradise, which will be lifted in paradise when we approach closer to God. It tells us there's a hijab between heaven and hell that can never be crossed. It talks about then hijab in terms of a curtain that the Prophet draws across to separate the intimate sphere of himself with his wife and family and the public sphere of where the others can come. So if we start talking about hijab in terms of spheres, then I want to suggest that we can see three different spheres. We can see an intimate sphere, me and my wife alone. We can see a family sphere, the curtains are drawn, we're all family here. And we can see a public sphere. Now this means that certain forms of conversation are appropriate to the intimate sphere, and they wouldn't be appropriate in the family sphere. And they certainly wouldn't be appropriate in the public sphere. So we're talking about modesty of speech. Is it appropriate to talk in that way? Well, it depends on the context in which you speak. And then we can go on to say, well, obviously, certain forms of dress are appropriate to the intimate sphere, to the family sphere, and to the public sphere. Do you go out in fluffy pink slippers? No, it's not appropriate. But bikinis are fine in the intimate sphere. So now, you see, you're talking the language that human beings can understand. I can follow all this stuff. And then, the next little taboo we need to break is, we need to ask them, and when the Quran starts talking about modesty for human beings, who are the first group to be addressed? Men. Oh, all you believing men, cast down your eyes and guard your private parts, for God knows best. And then it repeats exactly the same thing to women. But it's first of all addressed to men. So we've broken the taboo that somehow hijab is something about women. And then it starts to take us into a much deeper understanding of this thing, because it says that it is my eyes that are the principal vehicle of immodesty. What do you feast your eyes on? What do you look at? Now imagine, if you're in London on the tubes, you're surrounded totally all the time by bits of people pushed in your face, much closer than you'd like to be. You're much closer up against people than you'd like to be. And you're surrounded by advertising all the time. So actually, custody of the eyes becomes a massively important part of your hijab. Think about some of your friends, none of you of course, but think about some of your friends. Is it not a fairly common sight to see, for example, a woman wearing a headscarf, but everything from the neck downwards is immodest? Huh? Either the clothes are cut so tight, or the way she walks, or the way she talks, or the way she uses her eyes. So since when does modesty amount to a square metre of cloth? And then we go on and we talk about dress, and we talk about how much of you should be covered in the intimate sphere, in the family sphere, in the public sphere. And then we talk about practicalities. What do you think Muslim women do before they have washing machines, when they got to get into the wash tub? They roll their sleeves up. It's kind of practical. What do you think Muslim men and women do when they're working in a paddy field? Roll the legs up. So Islam is practical. It's not, if we reduce hijab to talking about square centimetres of exposed skin, we have fundamentally distorted the message in such a way that people think Islam and hijab is just for a bunch of freaks. But I have never known an example when, if one starts to discuss it in this way, that there aren't every man and woman sitting in the room saying, well, there's something in this, I wouldn't go out, but it's okay with my partner, and so on, because we're talking about a human condition, and we're talking about human responsibility and human modesty. So I think we need to be really careful and have it worked out in advance. There's no point in thinking you can make it up on the spot. Somebody asks you a question about hijab, you've got to have thought out, where am I going to start? How am I going to take this forward? And that can be different depending on different groups of people who are there. And I'm not suggesting here that headscarves are not important, or, skinny jeans for gentlemen are not, not that, that's not the issue. I want to talk about the human condition. Because if we're talking about the human condition, we are, I think, talking about Islam. Another pause, because I haven't had an interruption for a while. Anybody want to come in and say? Yes, go on. I can see your toe. Go on.
Yes, trouble is my second name. But you mentioned earlier on when you were explaining things from non-Muslim, you're talking about this life and the next life.
Yeah.
And drawing from that, do you think that would sound a bit freakish in its essence as well? Because, having been a Muslim and trying to, from a young age, trying to find a balance between this life and the next life and the understanding, I've had difficulties with it. So somebody who's not of the understanding, or even somebody within Islam, would also have great difficulties with it and find it a bit freakish.
Yes, I think you've got a valid point. I'd say two things. One is, I always talk about human flourishing in this life. See, a lot of people think religious people are killjoys. Never get a laugh out of them. They're the most unhappy people I know. Because they normally go past church on a Sunday morning, God, that's over. Now, so we've got to talk about human flourishing, because if it's not about living a complete and full human life, what is it for then? Did God, want to make us somehow distorted? But then, secondly, I think actually, we're often told this society is very secular and so on, but there are an awful lot of people who wouldn't say they were religious, but they kind of think something happens after death. They kind of think that isn't the end of it. And one's awaking that sort of consciousness. You see, without sort of whomping it into them and saying, this is what hell's like, children, do you want to go there? You are trying to awake a consciousness, which if we take this whole sort of, pre-embodied covenant stuff and the Dinal Fitra stuff, you are awaking within people. Please.
How would you present that to an atheist or an agnostic?
I think I just say, this is how we see it, this is what we believe. And once you've sown that seed, you allow it to work in the human heart. See, people sometimes come to me and said, I've converted 100 Muslims to be Christians, or more likely, I've converted 1,000 Christians to become Muslims, And I say, my friend, let me just explain this. You didn't ever convert anybody. Huh? That's God's work. If God doesn't stir the human heart in this way, all your talk is a waste of time. Now, there is a sense in understanding, if we're trying to present understanding, we have, as it were, to, toss the ball in the air, allow it to be there, and allow God to get on with the thing. So, maybe the atheist is saying, it's a load of rubbish. Probably say something stronger than that. We don't believe there's anything after death. But then, maybe little things trickle around in their heads and maybe you come to different understandings. We have a notion in educational theory of what we call a spiraling curriculum, which means that, it's like a spiral that goes round. You go and visit the points, and you touch on them. And then the next time round, you go rather deeper and you've prepared the ground and it's now broken up a bit, And the next time round, you go a lot deeper and you're making a lot more links and connections. So there's that sort of feel about it. But if somebody says to me, I don't believe there's anything after life, I don't believe God exists. Okay, it's not my problem. I mean, God didn't cry his eyes out over this, if God had eyes, which he hasn't. But, if God isn't so upset about it, why should I be? You just, you're sent as a warner, the prophet is told. You're not sent to cry your eyes out in the pillow because they don't hear you. That's my job, says God. I touch the human heart. You put it out there. Let the ball spin a bit and see what happens. That's because I don't get paid by the number of people I've converted. I'd be I'd be dead. I wouldn't even get anything to eat. Are we happy to move on? Okay, the next theme I want to just explore a little bit is, I think it's a crucial theme to talk about continuity. You see, we've established now, we've gone back to the crack of creation here, but we want to talk about continuity. Because the Quran tells us no people on earth has been left without guidance. God has no favourites. The whole of humankind stand in an equal relationship with God. So therefore, how is that? How is that in practice? Well, how many prophets have been sent to the earth? Don't know. You don't know, the Quran says. There's a hadith of the Prophet that talks about 124,000. How many do you know for sure? 25. Well, that's 123,975 vacancies on the list. There's a fair amount then that you don't know. You see, remember, when the Christians arrived in Africa, they were going to the dark continent because there was no light there before we got there. That is not a Muslim attitude. What all this stuff is saying, that when we go and encounter a new people, we go with a degree of humility, reverence and respect, saying God has been here before us. God has planted in the hearts of these people at some time in their human history the revelation from God, the guidance from God on how to live a human life. Therefore, we approach a new community with this sense of reverence and humility. God has been there before us. Now, this is what I'm trying to represent here. So all these little raindrops are how many? How many books have been sent? No idea. Hundreds anyway. Thousands perhaps. We just don't know. We only know 5 for sure from the Quran. So again, we've got this great degree of unknown here. Now, for me, it's very important to, just push this a little bit and say, when the Mughals ruled India, they encountered what we call Vedantic Hindus, those people who followed the Vedas, and they said, wait a minute, these guys have got a book. Now let's go and have a look at this book and see if it could be what was left over from what God has sent to them originally. And in the same way, when they encountered the Buddhists, they say, wait a minute, these people are the followers of the Buddha. Maybe the Buddha was an earlier prophet. So the disposition is one of openness. Of course, you're not just swallowing it. He says, prophet, that must be one. What you're doing is comparing the known with the unknown. What do you know about? We know about the life of Prophet Muhammad. That becomes our benchmark. What do you know about? We know about the contents of the Quran. That becomes Al-Furqan. It becomes the criterion. But we are open, yes, possibly on the balance of probabilities, and that was the decision of the scholars of India with regard to the Buddha, with regard to the Vedas. Yeah, we can't say for sure, but it may well have been. What's left over from? So that's all these raindrops over here. Then you see, I want to draw a model that says there is one and only God, there is one and only Kalam Allah, and it's in the cloud because it's up there with God, wherever that is. And it is sent down then to the earth multiple times in human history to human prophets, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, in human languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and those are gathered together into books or scriptures. Now what we're saying is one message sent to multiple prophets in the language that they understood. Well, manifestly, I assume, God doesn't go around ordering breakfast in Arabic. Therefore, what we're talking about is the Kalam Allah, the speech or the word of God, which is penetrating through into this earthly creation in earthly languages. One Kalam Allah, many languages, many prophets, and therefore many books. Now, then, we can get into a discussion. Well, is the Torah as we have it today, the Torah, of which the Quran speaks? What's the Injil, etc., etc.? But we've got the principle of continuity. And what I want to try and say is, lots of people who have been educated in our society think visually. You need to try and draw diagrams. You need to try and give visual pictures. That's the way people think. Now, if you just look at that, the picture tells a story. It tells a story of single Kalam Allah, multiplicity of prophets, multiplicity of languages, and multiplicity of books. And the picture tells the story. Now, I think that's a very important model. I want to move on, if we are agreeable, because I've got more than I'm going to get in, but I want to do at least 2 more things. Please, sir.
Another common point, I was wondering, is there a reason for omitting the Psalms from here?
No, it just happens to fit in, but they're also in Hebrew. But I have another diagram, another model, in which I have 5 prophets and 5 books, and I do all 5 like that. There's no other reason for omitting. No. It's just that you've got 3 prophets, 3 languages, and it fits on the board.
That's also common point with theory.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and Abraham and the Shehuf and so on, But, the point is made, I think, with 3. But you can do it with 5 if you've got a wider board or a PowerPoint, if it works. If you go back to your usul fiqh, if you are wanting to apply the principles of Islam into any society, the first thing you need to do is to study that society, to study its customs, its practices, its social arrangement, its organization. Because presumably we don't think that 21st century Britain is somehow the same kind of society as 7th century Arabia. Although there are, of course, Muslims who think that, called Taliban. Anyway, never mind. But now, let's take that much more seriously than we do. How do you think you can be equipped to help people to understand about Islam in this society if you don't understand this society? If you don't understand its cultural heritage and its literature, if you don't understand its principal religion, it's good. If you don't understand the religious history and sociology of Britain, you can't shape the key to fit the lock because you don't know what the lock looks like. For example, when our dear beloved friend Rowan Williams made his speech about accommodating elements of the Sharia into British law, if he'd come to me first, I'd have said, why don't you start off by saying, thanks be to God, we have a huge amount of Sharia in British law, because it's called justice. There's no such thing as Muslim justice or Christian justice or European justice. It's justice. Where you find justice, there you find the Sharia. Now, and that's the case then, if we don't understand the justice system, if we don't understand the way that justice, how have we struggled to get the legal system that we have, how can one begin to talk about Islam in this society? If you don't understand the religious settlement of how we end up with this freaky organisation called the Church of England in English society, and how it's very different in Wales and in Scotland, how can you help people to see how Islam fits into the picture? We need to find elements within the common experience of the human beings we're talking to that we can touch into to help them to explain. For example, we're all aware, especially those of us who are not Arabic mother tongue, and that means most of us in the room except me, because, however, we know that the vast majority of Muslims on earth today do not have Arabic as their mother tongue. We know that a slightly less vast majority of Muslims on earth today do not command the Arabic language. Now, if you say those two things, and then you say every Muslim prays Salah in Arabic, every Muslim memorizes some verses of the Quran in Arabic and recites them in their Salah, you and half a bunch of freaks. What are you doing? Reciting stuff that you don't understand because you've learnt it phonetically, and that's how you talk to God? Now, you can't talk about prayer in that way. You can't talk about the Quran in that way, because if you do, you're going to fundamentally distort it. So, for example, then, how do we talk to people about the spiritual relationship between the Muslim human being and the divine through the vehicle of the Quran, even though I cannot decode the text? And yet it is the word of God that trips over my tongue, the word of God that lives in my heart, the word of God that stirs my emotions. What are you doing? Crying over the word of God being recited and you don't know what the text means. But it happens. It is the case. Now, where do we find examples from that? Well, you will know there are lots of people in British society who will go to Italian opera and they will be moved by it. Do you understand Italian? No, I don't. But it's a spiritual experience. It puts me in touch with something beyond myself. Now, a model like that helps us to unpack what's going on. We've lots of religious people, lots of Catholics, but not just Catholics, who long to hear the beautiful chanting of the Latin Mass. Do you understand Latin? No, that's not the point. It's a spiritual experience. It moves me. It moves my spirits and elevates them to God. It is a vehicle for a relationship with God. Now, if this is what we're talking about, we need to find ways of talking about it that don't distort it. And actually, the normal ways, I argue, do distort it. I want to give you this because it's a Shia specific one, just to prove that I know a little bit. Think now, while I'm just scrubbing the board, what model would you draw to talk about the indwelling light of God that passes from one imam to the other and then continues to radiate through the world through the presence of the hidden imam amongst us? How do you talk to people about that? How do you draw that? Well, this is a helpful way that I found. And what it is that you draw a set of steps. And they are 12 in number. And then we've all seen small children in school being taught to read or being taught to go through a song by a bouncing ball that goes from one to the other. So we have a bouncing ball of light that goes down the staircase from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and at each one it glows, because that is the light of the present time. And when it reaches the bottom step here, which is number 12, as it were, it continues to pulse. We've got to talk some way about how do you talk about the real presence of the hidden imam within society, though you cannot see him, though you cannot communicate with him. And yet we want to talk about the imam of the present age. Now, if we can't find some way to draw it, some way to take people into those kind of ideas, we're not really communicating. And we end up, well, I'll say it again, acting like a bunch of freaks. So, now, I want to show you another drawing, and this time I've got it on a bit of paper so as it looks a bit better. Now, the rule is you're not allowed to turn it over until I say go. But you can look at the one that I give you, okay? Now, okay. And the question is this: how do you draw Islam? How do you draw it out? And by Islam here, I mean that Islam based on Quran and Prophet, the Islam that we would sort of recognize in the streets, as it were. Sorry, you get this one left-handed because they won't separate. How do you draw it out? And on this page here, you've got my attempt to draw a model or a paradigm of Sunni Islam. There you are. Half of it's in Arabic, so that'll be easy for lots of us. Now, this is a paradigm is a model that puts things into, she's allowed to turn it over, but not the rest of you. Now, a paradigm is a model that puts things into a relationship with one another. And so it connotes movement. That's why they look like signposts. And they go round in a circle. And you notice that the circle doesn't start until you get into the stage of Kalam Allah. Because God is outside that circle of time. And so we begin then with God who speaks the Kalam Allah, which is sent down in the scriptures, which fill the prophet, and the prophets then, plural, the prophets then live out that message. The prophet as the perfect human being, setting a way of life, a sunnah, laying down a customary practice, a sharia, a path through life, which is a struggle, and it's not easy to do it. There's not supposed to be a break if there is one. That was the photocopier. And what are the virtues that enable you to pursue this? They are taqwa and sabr. And you are heading to ihsan, which I refer to as the earthly state of being as close to being in paradise as you can get. Except the good thing about paradise is once you get in, you can't get out. But as long as you're on this life, there's always the chance of giving up the struggle. And then you end up in paradise. Now, note the juxtaposition of paradise and God. Now, before we turn over, on the other side, I'll tell you, just to whet the appetite, if the photocopier worked, is a Shia paradigm. Now, what are you doing then, giving us two different paradigms? What I want to say is that we have to learn to live with difference, and not to see difference as meaning I must be right and you must be wrong, but actually to see this as a richness from God to help us to see in different ways into the unfathomable mystery of God, and to teach us a degree of humility. Because if you think you were down the pub with God last night, which is the way a lot of religious people talk, you weren't. Yeah? Me and God, I know exactly what God thinks. Lots of people talk this way. Nonsense. You ain't got a clue. You haven't got a clue. You know, name me one positive assertion you can make about God. Well, hopefully God exists. But we've no idea what the existence of God looks like, children. Because God is by nature totally transcendent. Now, therefore, we have to learn to live with difference. And it should not be a problem to us. I mean, I teach a Sunni paradigm, and then I say, now shall we turn over? And now we'll look at the Shia paradigm. We have to turn the paper round as well, because the photocopier played tricks on us. Now, you will see that it's different. Because somehow we're trying to make sense of having both the revelation in the scriptures and the revelation through the light of prophecy and imamate, which affects, which plays on the human heart, the human as the pinnacle of creation. And so, within the human heart, we see the transformation that that light brings about, which manifests those virtues of God, those qualities of God, in the human being through the human heart, and therefore the transformative effect on the whole of creation. And then how do you draw the relationship between Ahlul Bayt, Quran, and a way of life? Well, here's my powerful angle poise shining through the Quran and giving us a roadway that comes out. But actually, the first drawing on the lower line is only relevant into 941. Because after then, if you look at the middle drawing and you see we have, the two tracks, but actually the two tracks from 941 onwards are not equal tracks. Because we do not have access to the hidden Imam. And therefore, the line of the Ahlul Bayt is a narrower line than the line of Quran. This is what I'm trying to say. You may or may not agree. And there we have the human being, and notice it's an android, it's neither male nor female, thanks be to God. And it's riding on the platform of the Sharia, which is riding on these twin deposits. And then guess what's poking out of the cloud above? How do you talk about the hidden Imam being like the sun hidden behind the clouds, for example? So you've got a visual way. And then we've got the question mark. If you know when Imam Al-Mahdi is going to return, please write it on a piece of paper, put it in a sealed envelope and give it to me, and I'll get down to the bookmakers. Okay, so there's the question mark. And what are you trying to do then? You're trying to grow in wisdom and purity. And then our last little bit on the right is my attempt to draw the continuity of this existence with the existence of Barzakh, which I describe as being life in another dimension, and then the post-resurrection experience when one continues to grow, and that little thing up there on the top right is, of course, infinity. Because you may ever grow in a closeness and embrace of God, but are you ever going to penetrate fully into that? So, now you may say, rubbish, that's not my Shia Islam, that's not my Sunni Islam, and you shouldn't do it anyway. That really doesn't matter. My question is, if we can't put it together in some way, we end up describing bits of the picture in a way that distorts the whole. So if my original definition is correct, that it is about a way of life that leads to human flourishing in this life and leads us ultimately into the closer embrace of paradise, you can see that you've got to try and draw that somehow and fit it all into a picture. Now, as I say, you're most welcome to take it and shred it and utter unspeakable curses as you do it, but think about a replacement. How would you do it? And you tinker with it, play. I don't pretend this is just the best that I've got at the moment.
Would you explain the difference between the notions of paradise and infinity?
Well, because, this is heresy now, so just let you know in advance. Because, the except for a small group amongst the Sufis within the Sunni school, you are talking of something like paradise is a state in which I dwell in the holy garden, and there in the middle of the holy garden is the holy mountain, and on the holy mountain is the holy cloud in which God dwells. And periodically, God comes out and I make darshan. So it's a state of dwelling in the presence of God. And this is Quranic. It's one of the ways the Quran talks about it. But it's not the way that I understand the Shia scholars to speak about it. In which paradise is an infinite progression, which we have begun in this life through a progression of wisdom and purity, which takes us through the life of Barzakh, through the life of resurrection, and on infinitely growing into the divine embrace. But never ultimately fully getting there. Otherwise you breach the barrier, as it were, and you become divine.
Well, yes, that is what, for very few, that is the case.
Yes.
A very evolutionary trend.
Yeah.
Within the Shia
Yeah.
theology, but for very few, the majority are complacent in whatever place they reach in paradise.
Oh, of course.
And so they stay there. So both notions
Yeah.
actually meet within the Shia theology.
Yeah,
This category.
yeah. But only if we make room for the complacent ones. Yeah, but so that's a good, it's a talking point, it's a discussion.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah,
I'm just saying,
But you see, having something like that, now we've done it very quickly and you're already a light year ahead of me, let alone the people I'm trying to teach. But it provokes some questions, why isn't God and paradise together then, you know?
I'm going back to the cutting edge of
Yeah.
the
I
science.
wanted to
Yeah.
ask a question. The way you explain the hijab is so real, and you can get the point across. However, does your audience not inquire of you that the practicing Muslim women, do they share the same understanding of hijab as you explain to us?
Yes, they do. And I say, look, I can't, I can only help you to understand what Islam says. I can't help you to understand what every Muslim woman walking down the street says. Because actually, if you stop Muslims on the street, be they men or women, you might get a picture that would make the alim's hair curl. But nevertheless, you see, I find it very interesting that one of the things that happened in London was different to Birmingham. One of the things that happened in London was it became absolutely normal that in every course, whether it was organised by Christians or whoever, there were Muslims present. And they wanted to come along and hear, what is this cowboy saying? Some of them were sent by their elders. Go and listen to him, and listen to the way that he tries to explain things. Listen to the way that he deals with questions. Because I think that's really important. If, for example, the average Muslim women on the streets of Small Heath don't understand hijab that way, whose fault is that? It's not theirs. That's what Granny told them. And we've not done the job of educating them in such a way that we can help to take them into a deeper meaning. Now that becomes immensely practical when you're a Muslim woman working in a bank in the City of London, for example, and you're a senior executive, and people are saying, look, you've got to dress in a snappy business suit. Well, can you make a snappy business suit if you're a man or a woman? Halal, can you make it acceptable to the principles of hijab? Well, of course you can, Just cut the jacket longer and don't make the trousers too tight fitting. Hey kids, you're away. And then we have to address the question of the headscarf. And I'm not going to give a fatwa on the question of whether or not it is wajib or what. But what I'm going to say is, maybe it's not the most important element in the story of modesty. The only time that I nearly got into a fight in a mosque, when I was doing a session like this, actually to be recorded and all the students present were young Muslim women from a school. Sorry, cameraman. It was the wretched cameraman who happened to be the only other man in the room. And he wanted me to say, because he knew a great deal, he wanted me to say, you cannot say that any Muslim woman is a practicing Muslim if they don't wear a headscarf. And I said, I'm not going to say that. You were asking me to tell these girls who were all wearing headscarves, that was the school uniform, you're asking me to tell them that some of their mothers are impious women? I'm not going to do that. You're asking me to tell them that that is the fundamental criteria? No, I've heard it said. Just recently I was talking with a group of Muslim people about the Farman, which was given by the Aga Khan in 1926 to the women to get it off, you see. And the response was frighteningly real. How is it that they could have given up that most important element of Islam? What have the teachers done if pious Muslim people who are in the mosque, all the time, actually think that is the most important element of Islam? Something has gone wrong there. That's not to say it's not important, but that it is the most important element, I find problematic. And we have to develop a discourse that allows us to talk in that way, I think. I am not prepared to call a Muslim woman some horrible name, which I won't mention, because she is modest in every element of her character and conduct, except that she doesn't cover her hair. You may, of course, but then you're on a higher limb than me. Right. Oh, well, time is up. So let me just tell you. Yeah. Can I go on for another 5 minutes? Is that permissible? Yeah? Okay. Some of the things that I would have talked about if time had permitted. I think we really have to visit again and think very carefully about the way that we translate key concepts. Sadaqah. Well, that's charity. No, it's not. It's bearing the burdens of your fellow human beings. That is a humanitarian principle. It's not bearing the burdens of your fellow Muslims or the fellow members of your village or your tribe, but it's bearing the burdens of other human beings. Charity is tossing a tanner to somebody as you go down the street. That's not what we're talking about. Then we need to find some examples for that. You know, the one that I used on Sunday was Islamic Relief. When they had the floods down in Cornwall, you remember, a few years ago? What did Islamic Relief do? They said, this is our chance to show them what Islam is really about. So they brought round their lorry, they bought as many bottles of water as could, stuff it full, they put Islamic Relief on the side of it, and then they beat all the way down to Cornwall. You know, and there's about 2 Muslims and a Muslim dog that live in Cornwall. Yeah? And they said, now these people will understand what Islam is about because we've scorched the tyres off it to come to bring them sadaqah because they are suffering human beings. So how do you translate it and how do you exemplify it? Abd. See, you get an awful lot of people who want to translate abd as slave. Slave is a dehumanizing thing to be. Servant, well, that's better. But in our context, in British society, servant is, you know, it's something down there. I want to translate abd as loving servant. I want to say that it is the one who serves God out of pure love for God alone. Are you okay for time, Abbas? Sorry, I don't want to keep you. Khalifa as well, you know. I want to translate Khalifa as regent. You know, half the time we're using Shakespearean terms that even we don't understand. What is the vicegerent, for goodness sake? Huh? And how is the vicegerent different to the vice-regent? They're totally different. Because the vicegerent is the regent. So let's use a word that we do understand and then explain it. You know? The Queen Empress sits in London and sends the Viceroy as her regent. Hear the regent, hear me. Obey the regent as you will obey me. And to the regent I say, cherish my people as I would cherish them if I were there. So the terminology is terribly important. Taqwa. For me, taqwa is one of the most fundamental concepts that we have to get across to people. And again, I want to translate it as living in God consciousness. In every fibre of my being, in everything I do and say and am, I am the servant of God. I have been given a high dignity by God. God has given me guidance. I am accountable to God. Even though I cannot see God, God sees me. And what symbol, what picture will you give me? Why does the Jewish man cover his head all the time? Because I am reminding myself that I stand constantly in the presence of God. All the time. In bed, in the shower. Yeah, in the shower. God is still present in the shower. So I push my little kippah to the back and I wash the front of my hair, and I push it to the front and I wash the back of my hair. Why does the Sikh man or woman who's initiated wearing the kashira, you take one leg out, you dry that leg, and you put that dry leg into the next pair before you dry and take off the second leg. Because you are constantly standing in the presence of God who calls you to modesty. Kuna? You hear the azan, you're leaping out of the shower, and you do your salah naked. Man or woman? Oh no, no. Why not? Because you're in the presence of God and the angels. So again, let's think of ways of talking about taqwa. Yeah, well, I'll end it here. But just to say, we have to find ways. We use a lot of God talk. God is all merciful. Now, we know, if we've made any serious study of this, that we haven't got a clue what the mercy of God really is like. We don't know how vast that mercy is. But how do we express that to people? We talk about, the love of God, the guidance of God, all these kind of God talk. And we talk about it as though, again, I was down the pub with God last night. Now, this is the language of analogy, and we have to help people understand it. A people for whom this doesn't make any serious, means nothing to me. So how are you going to do that? Well, a non-technical example I use, that lovely saying, God has 100 mercies, God sends one mercy to the earth to last all humankind for all ages and keeps 99 in reserve for the day of judgment. Now, if you could possibly understand the totality of mercy within the whole of creation throughout all times, you now understand precisely 1% of the mercy of God. So we've got to find ways of talking about it. Otherwise we think that, God is like my mum or something. Normally lets me off. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much.
Talk about salah in linking up the need for observing at the different times.
Yeah, I have another model. It's what I call a taqwa scope. Do please go if you need to. Don't feel that, there are, God loves the obligatory, but the supererogatory is up to you. We could do even 3 colours to make it look even more exciting. What I do is I draw this, and this is the line of taqwa. And then I draw the 5 beats of the day, which are the 5 canonical prayers. I hope that's 5. So that's salah. Well, you all know what that is. We don't need to label it. Now, then I say, this is the beauty of Islam. You don't need to be rich enough to own a watch. You don't need a priest to tell you, because every human being can see, when does the sun come up in the morning? When does the sun pass the middle of the sky? You stick your stick in, and when do its shadows lengthen? You've got to get home before the sun sets, otherwise you fall in a pit and break your leg. And then at night time before you go to bed. So this is the natural rhythm of the day for a human being without electricity. I rise before the sun. When the sun is in the middle of the sky, it's too hot to carry on, get your head down. When the sun has passed over, rise, wash, pray, back to work. Get home before the sun goes down. If you've ever lived without electricity, you know how important that is. And I mean without torches too. And then at night time. And then you see, you can talk then about grouping prayers. You can talk about why is it that we have 2 rak'ah for Fajr and 4 rak'ah for Isha. Because you've got a much bigger window, you've got, put the children to bed, you've got a bit of time for you and God. If it was 4 rak'ah in the morning, you'd miss it a lot more often because I haven't got time, I've got to go to work. So it's that practicality, that's the way I talk about it. Now, I draw it this way because I say, again, you see, if you just talk, if somebody says, tell us about prayer, and you wattle on about salah, They say, you freaky bunch. The only way you can talk to God is in a language you don't understand. In words that never change except for reciting of the Quran that you don't understand. And it's about dapping up and down in front of God. Well, no, that's what it looks like. So what I then say is, you see, here's me getting up in the morning, here's me recollecting my sin, asking God's forgiveness, doing my wudu and preparing for the prayer. Here's me listening to the Quran being recited and hearing again the guidance of God. And here's me in sujood. Here's me in my most fully human, in my moment of taqwa. I lay my best parts, my hand and my head before God on the floor. And I say with full humility and consciousness, you are God, and I am your obedient servant. Now, unfortunately, I don't stay up there, because here's me missing the bus. And here's me getting in a crush in the tube, and here's me getting to work and the coffee machine is empty. And I'm in a state of God forgetfulness right at this moment. Now, you see, never more than a few hours go by before I'm called back again to stand before God, to enter into my fully human taqwa. Now, that's only one part of the three-part form of prayer in Islam, because then we can put in our dua. Because here come our dua, you see. Dua are topping up my level of God consciousness all the time. They are flattening out my troughs. They are me consciously living my life in the presence of God. If you do every action Bismillah, you are topping up your taqwa all the time. And you are keeping yourself in that state, which enables you to say, if you were truly living all the time in a state of taqwa, there would be no room for sin, because there is no room for the shaitan to get in to tempt you away. No, we have the ayah of the Quran to this effect, let alone anything else. So then that's your dua, but then there are still too many troughs. And therefore, here comes my ticker on top. And you see, my ticker is my heart at work, remembering and praising God, when my body and my mind are doing other things. And so the three of them together promote this level to try and keep me in a state of taqwa. That's the way I talk about it. And then people, again, they say, well, hard to understand. Well, this is where you need to know who you're talking to. Because if you're talking to Catholics, you say, what does the Catholic Catechism say for the definition of prayer? Prayer is the raising of the mind and heart to God. There you are. There's your dua and there's your ticker. And if you're talking to Methodists, you say, surely you have the experience. You've lived with the Methodist hymn book so much, singing these hymns over and over again, that they just run through your heart without your consciousness being involved. And every Methodist will say, amen, that's just what happens. You know, I'm doing the shopping and I'm suddenly aware my heart is praising God. That's ticker. So we have to find ways that reach into people's common experience. That's how I do it. Don't get grey hairs for nothing, you know.
Okay, I think that ends today's session. Thank you, Dr. Chris. That was great insight, and I'm sure the way we changed the way that we express ourselves in front of others as well. There's tea, coffee, and I think some ice cream and stuff in the next room.